Have you ever woken up after a trauma and discovered that the person next to you wasn't there out of obligation, but because the idea of being anywhere else while you were vulnerable was simply unbearable? Because for Emma Carson, that moment of waking up in the hospital wasn't just about the relief of having survived or gratitude for having been rescued. It was about the devastating and wonderful realization that the man sitting beside her, exhausted, bloodstained, with eyes that revealed he hadn't slept since finding her, was there, not as Sheriff Jake Mercer fulfilling professional responsibility, but as a man who had discovered that she had become more important than his career, more important than his principles, more important than the very life he had so carefully built over 14 years. Emma woke up in the hospital with no complete memory of how she had gotten there. There were only fragments of memory floating through the haze of sedation and trauma, the sensation of hands cutting ropes that had bound her wrists, leaving raw marks. Jake's voice saying, "I'm here, you're safe," with an intensity that pierced through shock. That overwhelming feeling of safety, finally, after hours of pure terror, where she had genuinely believed she was going to die in that cold room, surrounded by men who saw her only as a problem to be eliminated. And when she opened her eyes, fully blinking through the soft morning light streaming through the hospital window, so different from the harsh lanterns of the storage room, and saw Jake sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside the bed, something inside her recognized a truth that had been brewing for weeks, but had never been fully admitted until that moment. Jake was broken in ways that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. His normally meticulously combed hair was completely disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it hundreds of times. The uniform he always kept impeccable was stained with blood that Emma instinctively knew wasn't his, but that of men he'd shot to save her. Stained with dust and cordite that told their own story of violence he'd used in her name. His eyes were red, not just from exhaustion, but from something deeper, the kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from being in a state of absolute terror for hours, and finally, being able to relax, minimally, knowing that the person you love is alive. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happened in that silent hospital room wasn't just romance, born from trauma or gratitude, being mistaken for love. It was a mutual recognition of a connection that had been forged through weeks of extreme pressure, moments of shared vulnerability, and impossible choices that revealed exactly who each of them was at their deepest core. It was Jake finally stopping rationalizing feelings as professional protection. It was Emma finally admitting that the trust she had in him went far beyond tactical competence. And when Jake lifted his head up, if he had sensed the exact moment Emma woke up, even though he had seemingly been asleep, as if some part of him was in tune with her in ways that weren't entirely rational. What Emma saw in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't just relief at seeing her awake and conscious. It wasn't just professional concern about the physical state of a witness he had sworn to protect. It was raw, unprotected love, a visceral fear of almost having lost her, still visible even hours after rescuing her, and that intensity that came from a man who had crossed every line he swore he would never cross, and who felt no regret at only overwhelming gratitude that she was alive so that he could look at her like that. Emma understood with devastating and wonderful clarity that something fundamental had changed between them in the last 12 hours. That what had begun as professional protection, a sheriff assigned to keep a witness safe, had transformed into something much deeper, more frightening, more impossible to deny or rationalize. It had become the kind of love that completely redefines who you are and what you're willing to do. 12 hours earlier, Emma had been tied to a metal chair in the abandoned warehouse, surrounded by men who had explicit instructions to kill her as soon as they confirmed that Jake wouldn't cooperate with their demands. 12 hours earlier, Jake had made a life-changing decision in seconds to leave the crime scene, to enter that warehouse, alone, to use lethal force in ways he knew would destroy his career and possibly land him in prison. 12 hours earlier, both had been at separate points in their own journeys, not fully aware of how deeply intertwined their lives had become. And now, in that silent hospital room, with the dim morning light painting everything in soft tones that seemed unreal after the darkness of the warehouse, they would have to face a truth they had both been avoiding through rationalizations and denials, and focusing on external danger, that this was no longer just about witness and protector, about criminal case and professional duty, about extraordinary circumstances forcing temporary proximity. It was about two people who had become absolutely essential to each other. It was about the transformation that happens when you see someone in their most vulnerable and courageous moments, and decide you want to stand by that person no matter the cost. It was about Jake realizing that the badge he'd worn for 14 years meant less than the woman looking down at him from that hospital bed. It was about Emma discovering that trusting someone completely, allowing herself to be protected without losing her own strength, loving someone enough to let them risk everything for her. All of this was possible in ways she had never imagined before meeting Jake Mercer. And in that first moment of full awareness, with her eyes finally focusing clearly and her mind processing where she was and who was beside her, Emma didn't say anything immediately. She just looked at Jake with that intensity that came from having gone through something that fundamentally changed you. From having looked at death and survived because someone decided that your life was worth more than rules or career or personal safety. Jake didn't speak in those first few seconds either. He just looked back, and Emma saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes. This man who had faced armed men without blinking, who had used lethal force without hesitation, who had remained functionally calm through hours of trauma. Finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened, now that she was awake and safe, and looking at him. If you've ever experienced a moment where you realized the person in front of you had become absolutely essential, not gradually, but suddenly, with breathtaking clarity, share in the comments what that moment meant to you. Because what Emma and Jake were experiencing in that hospital room went beyond romance or attraction. It was the recognition of a connection that had been forged through extreme circumstances, but was genuine and profound in ways that transcended the trauma that created it. Jake, Emma finally managed to say, her voice hoarse from not having used it for hours and from the tube they had put in during initial treatment. Just his name, but loaded with so much meaning that nothing more needed to be added. Emma, Jake replied, and there was a break in his voice that revealed exactly how close to his emotional breaking point he was. How are you feeling? The doctor said your injuries weren't serious, but that you needed rest, and he stopped, clearly struggling to maintain professional composure when everything inside him wanted to simply pull her into a hug and never let go. Emma could have responded with clinical details about wrist pain, or persistent headaches, or any number of minor physical discomforts. But that's not what came out. Safe, she said instead. For the first time in weeks, I feel completely safe, because you're here. If this part resonates with you, if you're feeling the weight of this moment where two people finally stop fighting what they feel and allow themselves to be completely vulnerable with each other, leave a like here. Because what comes next will show exactly what happens when love that grew in impossible circumstances has to face the reality of a world that doesn't stop just because you survived. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, and Emma saw how those simple words, "because you're here," deeply affected him. When he opened them again, there was determination mixed with vulnerability. "I'll stay," he said. And it wasn't a casual promise, but a vow Emma knew he would keep no matter what. "Emma, as long as you want me here, I'll stay." Emma reached out her hand, a movement that made her wrists protest, but which she ignored because the need to touch Jake, to physically confirm that he was real and present, outweighed any discomfort. Jake took her hand immediately, their fingers intertwining with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence he had used hours before. "They told me," Emma said softly, watching his face intently so as not to miss a single detail. "The nurses, when they brought me here, and you insisted on staying even when they tried to make you leave, they told me you lost your badge, that you could face criminal charges." "Jake, You ruined your entire career for me. And if you want to follow the rest of this journey, if you want to see how Jake and Emma navigate not only legal consequences, but public scrutiny and the pressure of a relationship that began in trauma, subscribe to the channel. Because this story is only beginning to reveal its most complex layers, and you won't want to miss the moment where they have to decide if a love worth risking everything for is also worth fighting for, when the whole world questions its legitimacy. Jake didn't look away, didn't try to minimize or rationalize what he had done. Not because of you, as if it were your fault. He corrected gently but firmly. I made conscious choices, Emma. I chose you over badge, over career, over the future I had planned. And I don't regret it one bit. Emma felt tears burning, threatening to overflow. But Jake, that badge meant everything to you. You told me about earning it, about what it represented. It meant a lot, Jake admitted. It's in the past, but Emma, you mean more. Much more. And if I had to choose again, I would make the exact same choices without hesitation. The weight of it, all of being loved so intensely that it led someone to sacrifice their entire constructed identity, was almost too much for Emma to process. Part of her wanted to protest, wanted to insist that he shouldn't have paid such a high price. But a deeper, more honest part of her recognized the truth, that if the situations were reversed, if Jake were in danger and Emma had the power to save him at the cost of everything else, she would do exactly the same. I don't know how to process this, Emma finally admitted, tears now streaming freely. Jake, you literally risked your freedom. You could go to prison for saving me. How do I live, knowing that you could lose years of your life for decisions you made in minutes? Jake leaned closer, using his free hand to gently wipe tears from her face. You live knowing that I made those choices out of love, not obligation, that I don't carry resentment or regret. Emma, the minutes I spent rescuing you were more important, more defining of who I truly am, than 14 years following rules that sometimes fail the people who need protection the most. Double quotes now. I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Emma's gradual awakening, that journey from unconsciousness to full consciousness, wasn't just about physical recovery from trauma. It was about a fundamental transformation in how she viewed her own life, her own strength, and the man who had become the absolute center of her world. And behind those first moments of consciousness lay a hidden truth about what really happens when you survive something that should have killed you, and discover that the person responsible for your survival paid a price you never would have asked for, but can't undo. Emma awoke gradually, consciousness returning, not all at once, but in successive waves that brought both increasing clarity and confusion about exactly what had happened in the hours since Jake had cut her free from that chair. The first wave brought awareness of physical sensations, the first thing her brain registered even before she opened her eyes or processed where she was. Pain, not acute or unbearable, but definitely present, constantly reminding her of injuries doctors had treated while she was under light sedation, which had made the last few hours hazy and fragmented. Aching wrists where zip ties had been tightened cruelly, cutting off circulation enough to leave deep marks that doctors had commented indicated how long she had been held captive. A throbbing cheek where one of her captors had struck her. Emma couldn't even remember which one specifically. Just sudden pain and the taste of blood, and the humiliation of being treated as an object instead of a person. Muscles protesting from hours, held in a forced position, unable to shift or stretch or relieve the tension that had built up. Throat scratched from screaming, that desperate scream of Jake's name when she'd heard his voice through the phone. A last cry of hope before the phone had been ripped away. A throbbing, low but persistent headache that was probably a combination of stress, dehydration, and the emotional impact of everything she'd experienced. A second wave of consciousness brought awareness of her surroundings, and the contrast with her last conscious hours was so pronounced that, for a moment, Emma thought she must still be dreaming or hallucinating. She was no longer in the cold, menacing warehouse, smelling of mold, rusty metal, and fear. She was in a clean, safe hospital room, enveloped in the smell of disinfectant and clean sheets washed in hot water, that institutional, yet comforting smell that signified modern medicine and professional care. The soft sound of monitors tracking vital signs, a steady, rhythmic beep, confirming that her heart was still beating, that her body was still functioning, that she had survived against odds that seemed impossible when she sat in that chair, listening to Marcus Reyes casually discuss the best way to dispose of her body. Soft, natural light filtered through partially closed curtains, so different from the harsh flashlights that had illuminated her face while they questioned and threatened her. Emma processed all of this in seconds that felt much longer, that strange distortion of time that happens when the brain is working at accelerated speed to understand a completely new situation. She was safe. She was in the hospital. She was alive against all the expectations she had developed during hours of captivity. And then came the third wave of awareness, the thing that made her heart race so fast, the monitor next to her registered it with faster beeps. The thing that made tears immediately fill her eyes, even before she was fully awake. Jake, sitting in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside the bed, as if he had been there for hours and hours without moving except for occasional obsessive checks that she was still breathing, that monitors still showed stable vital signs. And he had been, Emma would later discover through nurses who recounted the story with a mixture of exasperation and admiration. Jake had insisted on staying even when they repeatedly tried to get him to leave and rest. That he had absolutely refused to leave until Emma woke up and he could personally confirm, with his own eyes, that she was truly well and not just statistically stable according to monitors and medical reports. That he had threatened to cause trouble when the nursing supervisor had tried to invoke rules about visiting hours and the need for appropriate rest. Jake was leaning forward in that chair, which clearly hadn't been designed for someone to spend hours in. Elbows resting on his knees, head down as if he had finally succumbed to the exhaustion he'd probably been feeling for not just hours, but days. A posture Emma recognized from times she'd seen Jake when he thought she wasn't looking, that posture of a man carrying almost too much weight but refusing to collapse because people depended on him remaining strong. Emma just stared at him for a long moment, not announcing herself yet, just processing details that told their own story about what Jake had gone through in the hours since the rescue. Hair that he normally kept neatly styled with casual care was completely disheveled, not just unkempt, but in complete disarray, that suggested he had run his hands through it hundreds of times, that unconscious gesture of stress or frustration or fear. The uniform he always kept impeccable. Jake had once commented that professional appearance mattered, that a badge carried weight, that demanded visual respect, was stained with patterns that told a brutal story. Blood that Emma instinctively knew wasn't his, but that of men he had shot. Dark stains that had dried in irregular patterns. Dust from the depot covering shoulders and sleeves. Physical evidence of the violence he had used to save her, of lines he had crossed, of the transformation from a rule-abiding police officer into something far more primitive and desperate. Hands that were normally so steady and controlled. Emma had seen Jake handle a weapon with perfect precision, had seen him perform delicate tasks without trembling, trembled minimally even in apparent rest. Subtle tremors that Jake was probably not even aware of, but which revealed the emotional and physical cost of everything he had done, of adrenaline finally draining after hours, at peak intensity, of fear that he had felt but hadn't allowed himself to show at the time. And when Jake finally lifted his head, as if he had felt her gaze even through the exhaustion that should have left him oblivious to the world around him. As if some part of him was permanently attuned to her presence in ways that weren't entirely rational. What Emma saw in his eyes made her breath stop completely in tears that had been threatening to finally overflow. It wasn't just relief to see her awake and conscious. There was certainly that immediate flash of tension rising from his shoulders. his expression brightening slightly at the sight of her open, focused eyes. But there was much more. There was raw, unprotected love that Jake was no longer trying to hide behind professional rationalizations or justifications of duty. There was the visceral fear of almost having lost her still visible, even hours. After rescuing her, the kind of fear that leaves permanent scars. There was guilt. Tuma could see it in the way his eyes scanned her face, probably cataloging the bruises that had formed, the marks her captors had left. Guilt for not having protected her better, for not having anticipated the kidnapping, for having let her go to that apartment, even knowing it was risky. Irrational guilt, but deeply felt. And there was that intensity that Emma had seen building over the weeks, but which was, now, completely unmasked, the intensity of a man who had crossed every line he swore he would never cross, who had used lethal violence without hesitation, who had destroyed his career and risked his freedom, and who, looking at the woman he had saved, felt no regret, only overwhelming gratitude that she was alive so that he could look at her like that. "Emma," Jake said, his voice hoarse from hours of not using it properly, and from emotion he'd barely contained. Just her name, but laden with so much meaning that nothing more needed to be added in that initial moment. As if saying her name, hearing a response, seeing confirmation that she was truly conscious and present, was all that was needed. Emma tried to answer, but found that her own voice wasn't fully cooperating, her throat still scratchy, her mouth dry from hours without adequate water. She swallowed with difficulty, and tried again. "Jake," she finally managed to say, and saw how that name her saying, his name, affected Jake. Viscerally. Comment below. This is their most intense moment. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because that first moment of real connection, when Jake gently took Emma's hand in a way that contrasted sharply with the violence he had used hours earlier, wasn't just about physical comfort or mutual reassurance. It was about revealing a hidden truth they had both been avoiding for weeks. That what existed between them had completely transcended the boundaries of protector and protected, and had become something that would permanently change them both. And behind that simple touch lay an entire journey of transformation, of decisions that couldn't be undone, of the impact those weeks under extreme pressure had had on who they fundamentally were. It wasn't just relief to see her awake, although that was clearly the Emma could see in the way the tension lifted from Jake's shoulders when she responded, in how his breathing became slightly more regular. It wasn't just professional concern about the physical state of a witness she had sworn to protect, although Jake certainly had that concern too, considering how many times his eyes had gone to the monitor, tracking her vital signs. It was something far deeper and more vulnerable than any of those rational explanations. It was raw fear of almost having lost her, a fear Jake had carried since that 2:37 a.m. phone call when he heard Emma scream his name. A fear that had motivated every decision he made afterward. A fear still visible in the way he held her hand, as if letting go meant losing her again. It was exhaustion from hours of keeping vigil by her bedside, refusing to sleep or rest until he could see with his own eyes that she was truly okay. And it was love that Jake was no longer trying to hide or rationalize through professional explanations about duty or responsibility. Love that was naked and exposed in the way he looked at her, in the subtle tremor in his hands when he briefly touched her face before taking her hand, in the tears that Emma could see threatening in the corners of his eyes, even though he was clearly struggling to maintain some composure. "Emma," Jake said again, as if he needed to keep saying her name to confirm that she was really there, and not just a figment of his imagination, born of exhaustion and trauma. "You are," he stopped mid-sentence, swallowing hard as if trying to control an emotion that threatened to completely overflow. "How are you feeling?" "The doctors said the injuries weren't serious, but I need to hear from you." It was a mundane question on the surface. The kind of thing anyone would ask someone waking up in the hospital after trauma. But the way Jake asked it with that intensity that made each word carry the weight of everything left unsaid, with a tone that suggested her answer mattered more than anything else in the world, transformed it into something completely different. It transformed Jake into asking not just for a clinical evaluation, but for confirmation that Emma was truly present, truly conscious, truly capable of processing what had happened. Alive, Emma replied after a moment of considering how she truly felt, the word coming out with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Because hours ago, sitting in that chair, listening to Marcus Reyes discuss her execution with that casual calm that made it all the more terrifying, Emma had genuinely believed she wouldn't survive the night. I feel alive. Thanks. To you. Jake shook his head immediately, a movement so quick and emphatic that it revealed how much that characterization bothered him. No, Emma, no. I shouldn't have let you go to the apartment. I should have insisted it was too risky, that the possibility of a trap or surveillance was too high. I should have. He stopped abruptly, taking a deep breath as if trying to control the spiral of self-accusation that Emma could see beginning. I failed to protect you. You were kidnapped under my watch, tortured and threatened, all because I made poor tactical judgments about the security of that apartment. Jake? Emma interrupted him with a firmness that surprised them both, considering how weak her voice still sounded, extending her free hand toward him in a gesture that asked for a closer connection. Stop. Stop taking responsibility for the actions of criminals who made a conscious choice to kidnap me. You didn't fail to protect me, you saved me. You literally risked everything, to save me. Jake took her outstretched hand, and Emma felt his fingers tremble slightly as they made contact. He held it with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the strength Emma knew he possessed, with the calculated violence he had used just hours before to rescue her. A gentleness that revealed how precious he saw her, how carefully he wanted to treat her, now that she was hurt and vulnerable. And Jake simply held her hand like that for a long moment, his thumb tracing unconscious circles on the back of her hand, a gesture that Emma realized he probably wasn't even conscious of making, but which revealed a deep need for constant physical contact, for tactile confirmation that she was really there, alive and safe and touchable. You don't understand what it cost, Jake finally said, his voice low but heavy with the weight of everything that had happened in the hours since the rescue. Emma, when I heard you scream my name through that phone, when the line cut and I couldn't call back, something inside me broke. Or perhaps, more precisely, something I had been holding on to broke. He looked at her hand, which she was holding, avoiding eye contact as if what he was about to admit was too difficult to say, while looking directly at her. I spent 14 years building a career, building a reputation as an officer who followed the rules, who did things the right way. And in 3 hours I destroyed all of that. Not gradually or through a series of questionable choices, but deliberately and without hesitation. Emma squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue, even though part of her was afraid of what would come next. The nurses told me something about you losing your badge, about possible charges. But Jake, I didn't hear the full details, and I need to know exactly what happened after you rescued me. Jake finally looked up, meeting her eyes, and what Emma saw there made her heart clench painfully. Not regret, but a heavy acceptance of the sacrifice she had made. I shot 3 men. 1 died on the spot, the one who tried to use you as a shield. The other 2 are in surgery, but will survive. I entered that warehouse without a warrant, without authorization, without adequate backup. I used lethal force in ways that no court will see as justified under normal law enforcement standards. He paused, taking a deep breath. Captain Morrison confiscated my badge and weapon as soon as I processed what had happened. I'm suspended, indefinitely pending formal investigation. And Emma, prosecutor Sandra Chen, who has a reputation for being exceptionally tough on police misconduct, is considering multiple criminal charges against me. Voluntary manslaughter, aggravated assault, operating as a vigilante without legal authority. Emma felt nausea rising, not from physical injuries, but from the devastating weight of what Jake was describing. You could go to prison, she whispered. Jake, you could literally go to prison for saving me. Yes, Jake admitted with brutal honesty, making no attempt to sugarcoat the reality. It's a real possibility. It depends on how aggressive Chen wants to be, how the jury views my actions, and a dozen legal factors I don't fully control. Emma was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she processed the enormity of the sacrifice Jake had made. This isn't Jake. This isn't fair. You did the right thing. You saved me from people who were going to kill me. How can the system want to punish you for that? The system has rules, Jake said with that frustrating calm that came from having fully processed this for hours, sitting beside her bed. And I broke those rules in ways that can't be ignored or justified through generous interpretation. Emma, I didn't enter that warehouse as a law enforcement officer carrying out an authorized rescue. I entered as a desperate man willing to do anything necessary to get back the woman I love. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Jake's last sentence, I went in like a desperate man willing to do anything necessary to get back the woman I love, wasn't an accidental slip or an admission made under extreme stress without thinking. It was a deliberate and vulnerable revelation of truth that Jake had finally stopped rationalizing or hiding. And the impact of those words, the transformation they caused in how Emma viewed not only Jake but their entire relationship, would reveal, behind the scenes of their whole journey, that they had shared something they had both felt but neither had dared to name until that moment. The words hung in the air between them. Woman I love. And Emma saw Jake register what he had just said. Saw the moment where he clearly considered trying to retract or soften it, but then decided against it. He decided to leave that truth there, exposed and vulnerable. Because it had reached a point where hiding it no longer made sense, where pretending that feelings were merely professional or born of circumstances was an insult to both of them. You love him, Emma repeated, not as a question but as confirmation of what she had heard, needing to hear him say it again because her brain was still processing the enormity of that admission. Jake, you said I love you, Jake repeated, this time looking directly at her with an intensity that allowed no misunderstanding or ambiguity. Emma, I love you in ways that go far beyond what I should feel as a witness under my protection. I love you in ways that frighten me, because they mean that rational choices become impossible when you're in danger. I love you enough to destroy the career I've built over 14 years, without hesitation when the alternative was leaving you in the hands of people who plan to kill you. He squeezed her hand, as if he needed that physical contact to anchor himself, while finally verbalizing everything he had been feeling. And Emma, I'm not telling you this, expecting you to reciprocate my feelings, or because I feel you owe me something as ransom. I'm telling you because I almost lost you. And the idea of not having told you this when I had the chance is unbearable. Emma was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face so quickly she didn't even try to wipe them away. Simply letting them fall as she processed not just the words but the full weight of what they represented. Jake Mercer, a man who had lived his entire life by rules and protocols, who had built his identity around being an exemplary police officer, who had always placed duty above personal desires, had destroyed all of that for her. Not out of obligation or momentary impulse, but out of conscious and deliberate love. They told me more, Emma managed to say when she finally trusted her voice not to break completely, watching Jake's face so intently that she didn't miss a single detail of how he reacted to each word. The nurses who were taking care of me when they brought me in, they said, you shot 3 men in the warehouse. That one died right there, the one who tried to use me as a shield, the one who turned toward me with his gun raised. That you lost your badge because of all those actions. Jake didn't look away, as Emma had somewhat expected. Didn't try to downplay what he'd done or rationalize it with tactical explanations that would make it sound less definitive. He simply nodded once, an economical gesture that confirmed facts without trying to avoid their weight. Yes, all of that is true. Emma felt new tears burning, mingling with those already falling, creating warm trails down her cheeks. You lost your entire career. The badge you carried for 14 years, that meant everything to you. The identity you built since you were 22. You lost all of that. For me, because of you. Jake corrected gently, but also firmly, not accepting that Emma should carry this as guilt. Not because of you, as if it were your fault that criminals kidnapped you, or that the system has protocols that sometimes protect procedures more than people. I chose you, Emma, consciously, deliberately, and without any regret worthy of the name. Emma knew she should say something about how he shouldn't have done that, about how the price was too high for anyone to pay, about how the badge meant everything to him, and what she had heard in his voice when he spoke about earning it, about what it represented. Appropriate words lay on the edge of her conscience protests, about the sacrifice being disproportionate, insistences that she wasn't worth destroying a lifetime's worth of work. But words wouldn't come. They remained stuck in her throat because part of her, the selfish and desperate part that had spent hours genuinely believing she was going to die in that chair, that had screamed Jake's name as a last cry for help before accepting imminent death, was incredibly, overwhelmingly grateful that he had chosen exactly as he had, that he hadn't followed protocol that would have come too late, that he hadn't prioritized his career over her life, that he had decided she was worth more than anything else. They told me more, Emma continued after a moment, gathering the courage to verbalize the rest, her voice growing smaller as she grasped the full enormity. The nurses mentioned, they said you could face criminal charges, that the prosecutor is considering not just departmental disciplinary matters but actual criminal charges, homicide, assault, operating as a vigilante. Sandra Chen is an aggressive prosecutor with a well-established reputation, Jake admitted, and there was weariness in his voice that went beyond physical exhaustion. She sees cases of police misconduct as opportunities to make examples, to send messages about accountability. And I technically committed multiple crimes, serious crimes, that are clearly documented and that I cannot deny because they happened. Exactly as she will allege, Emma felt a sudden rage burning through all other emotions, rage at the system that saved procedure but punished courage. Anger at the prosecutor, who saw case numbers instead of lives saved. This isn't fair, she said vehemently, her voice louder than it had been. Jake, this isn't even remotely fair. You saved me. You literally did the right thing, the morally correct thing, even if it technically violated rules. How can the system want to punish you for that? The justice system doesn't always align perfectly with morality, Jake said, echoing almost word for word what Rebecca had said in the warehouse when she arrived and found the scene of 3 men shot. Rules exist for reasons: to protect rights, to prevent officers from operating as personal enforcers, to maintain order. And I broke those rules in ways that can't be ignored or justified through generous legal interpretation. Jake shifted his position slightly, bringing his free hand to cover where he was holding Emma's hand, creating that feeling of being completely enveloped by his presence. Emma, I didn't enter that warehouse as a properly authorized law enforcement officer conducting a hostage rescue. I didn't follow protocol about waiting for backup or coordinating with other agencies. I didn't give the men inside a proper opportunity to surrender before using lethal force. I went in as a desperate man, willing to do absolutely anything necessary to get back the woman I love. But, Emma, Jake continued, his voice growing even more intense, I don't regret it. I'm not feigning regret to make Chen happy or to improve my chances in court. Even knowing all the consequences, losing my badge, facing possible prison, having my name publicly destroyed, I would do it all exactly the same way if I had to choose again. Comment below. He doesn't regret anything he did. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Jake's statement, I have no regrets, I would do everything exactly the same way, wasn't bravado or a masculine posture, trying to appear strong in the face of adversity. It was the naked and vulnerable truth of a man who had discovered something about himself. During those desperate hours searching for Emma, something that completely transformed how he viewed his own life and priorities. And behind that absolute certainty was the journey of a man who had lived by rules, discovering that some things transcend rules, that real love changes not only what you are willing to do, but who you fundamentally are. Emma squeezed his hand so hard that her aching wrists protested, but she completely ignored it because the need to physically connect with Jake, to anchor him there with her through touch, outweighed any discomfort. "Why?" she asked, and there was genuine urgency in her voice, a need to understand the motivation behind such an enormous sacrifice. "Jake, why risk so much? Why destroy your entire career, risk your freedom, transform yourself into exactly the kind of vigilante you've always fought against?" No. Jake interrupted her with such intensity that he literally silenced Emma mid-sentence, with a firmness that refused to let her finish that thought. "Don't end that sentence by saying it's just anything. Emma, you're not just a witness who happened to see a crime by mistake. You're not just a case that was assigned to me by chance scheduling. You're not just a person under my protection by professional obligation." Jake leaned closer, and Emma could see every detail of emotion passing across his face, vulnerability he normally hid beneath layers of professional competence, now completely exposed. "You've become the most important person in my life. I don't know exactly when it happened, whether it was a gradual transformation over weeks of living together under constant pressure, sharing space and fears and moments of vulnerability, or whether it was a specific moment when I realized. It may be when you insisted on learning how to use a gun because you didn't want to be a passive victim. Or when you made coffee the way I like it without me mentioning it. Or in one of the hundreds of small interactions that built something bigger." He paused, taking a deep breath as if gathering the courage to fully verbalize what was coming next. "But Emma, at some point during these weeks, you stopped being a responsibility and became the person I think about when I wake up in the morning. The person whose laughter makes difficult days seem manageable. The person whose safety matters more than my own, more than my career, more than the principles I've built my whole life defending." Jake's voice grew hoarser, more laden with emotion. "And the idea of losing you, not abstractly but concretely, of receiving that call and hearing you scream my name and then the line cutting, of imagining arriving at that warehouse and finding a body instead of you, alive, that terrified me in ways that combat never did. Because, in combat, I only risked my own life. But with you in danger, I was risking losing the person who had become the center of my world without me even fully realizing it until the possibility of losing her became real." Emma was crying openly now, tears streaming so freely that she didn't even try to control them, just letting them fall while holding Jake's hand with both of hers, needing that double contact, as if one hand wasn't enough to express the intensity of what she was feeling. "Jake, she began, but her voice broke completely under the weight of emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Jake said quickly, and there was something like fear in his voice, fear that Emma would feel obligated to reciprocate his feelings out of gratitude or shared trauma or some distorted sense of duty. "Emma, I'm not telling you this expecting reciprocity or creating pressure for you to feel something you don't feel. I'm not telling you this because I just saved you, and I think that obligates you to some specific emotional response. I'm telling you this because I almost lost you, and the idea of not having been honest about how I feel when I had the chance is I love you." Emma interrupted him, the words slipping out before she could reconsider the timing or question whether it was too soon or if she was confusing gratitude with love or any of the hundreds of rationalizations her mind offered. "Jake, I love you. And no, it's not because you saved me tonight, although that's part of who you are. It's not because of shared trauma or Stockholm Syndrome, or any other psychological explanation people will suggest when they hear about us." Emma forced herself to maintain eye contact, to let him see the complete truth in her eyes. "I love you because you are the most genuinely good man I have ever known. Because, when I had to entrust someone with my life, you proved yourself worthy of that trust, in ways that go far beyond tactical competence. Love you, because you treat me as an equal even when I am scared, and vulnerably you never made me feel weak for being afraid. You only helped me find my own strength. The words were coming faster now, as if Emma had been holding all of this in for so long, that now that the floodgates had opened, she couldn't stop the flow. I love you because you chose to do the right thing, even though it literally cost you everything. Because when the system said follow protocol and she'll probably die, and love said break all the rules and she'll live, you chose love without hesitation. I love you for the vulnerability you show when you think I'm not looking. For the way you make coffee at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep. For how you read reports with that intense concentration that makes you forget to eat. Emma was laughing through her tears now. That strange laugh that happens when emotions are too intense to contain in a single expression. I love you because in the last few weeks, you've become the person who makes me want a future instead of just surviving the present. I love you because even facing the loss of everything, you're sitting here holding my hand as if this is the only place you want to be. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because that moment after Emma said I love you, those 3 seconds where Jake stood completely still, processing words he had expected but hadn't dared to hope for, wasn't just about surprise or relief. It was about the final and complete transformation of a relationship that had been built under impossible circumstances, finally being recognized as real and legitimate by both of them. And behind those seconds was the entire journey of 2 people who had fought against growing feelings because the timing seemed wrong, because circumstances were complicated, because admitting love seemed impossible when they were still just fighting to survive. Jake stood completely still for 3 seconds that seemed to stretch into an eternity, enough time for Emma to begin to question whether she had said something wrong, whether she had misinterpreted signals, whether his confession of love had been more complicated than the simple words I love you she had offered in response. Enough time for doubt to begin creeping in, for all those rationalizations about trauma and gratitude to return, whispering that perhaps she was confusing the intensity of circumstances with genuine love. And then Jake was moving, breaking through that paralysis in a way that was both quick and gentle. He leaned forward in the uncomfortable chair, his free hand that wasn't holding Emma going to her face with a care that contrasted completely with the urgency visible in his eyes, fingers lightly touching her cheek, his thumb tracing her jawline as if memorizing her skin texture, as if needing to confirm through touch that she was real and present and saying words he had longed to hear. And then Jake was kissing her with a mixture of reverence and desperation that made Emma's heart race until she could hear the monitor beside her registering a sudden increase in heart rate. It wasn't a perfect cinematic kiss with ideal angles and swelling music in the background. Both had been through trauma in the last few hours, Emma with physical injuries that still ached, and Jake with exhaustion that went far beyond lack of sleep. Both were emotionally devastated in ways that would make any interaction anything less than smooth. Emma's lips were chapped from hours without proper water. There was still a taste of blood in her mouth from where she had bitten her tongue during the kidnapping. Jake had days of stubble that had minimally scratched her skin, and his hands still trembled, with those fine tremors of adrenaline finally draining after hours at peak levels. But it was perfect in every way that truly mattered. It was honest, instead of performative, not trying to impress or seduce, but simply expressing everything that words hadn't been able to fully capture. It was vulnerable in a way that cinematic kisses never are, charged with fear and relief and love and gratitude, and all those complex emotions that don't fit into simple categories. And it was charged with everything they had been feeling, but not saying for weeks, all the unresolved tension, all the denied attraction, all the moments where they had wanted to do exactly that but it had seemed impossible or inappropriate given the circumstances. Emma brought her free hand to Jake's neck, fingers sliding through his messy hair, pulling him slightly closer, even if the movement caused his wounds to protest. And Jake responded by deepening the kiss, not aggressively, but with that controlled intensity that characterized everything about him, always aware of his own strength. Always calibrating to ensure he didn't hurt Emma even when he clearly wanted more. When they finally separated, not by choice, but because they both needed to breathe properly, and because a nurse would likely be coming in soon to check vital signs, both were breathing irregularly, their hearts beating in a way that the monitor clearly registered. Jake rested his forehead against hers, that contact keeping them physically connected even though the kiss had ended, as if he couldn't bear to completely break contact. "Emma," Jake whispered, his voice hoarse and heavy with emotion, "I love you too. God, I love you so much, it's scary. I love you in ways I've never loved anyone before. In ways that make everything else I thought love was, seem like pale shadows." Emma laughed through the tears that were still falling. That wet, broken laugh that was half joy, half overwhelming relief. "Good, because we're going to need it. Jake, you're facing criminal charges, possibly. Castellano is still free on bail, manipulating the system through expensive lawyers. And our whole life is a complicated mess that's going to take months or years to untangle." "Yes," Jake agreed, not trying to downplay or offer empty reassurances that everything would be all right. "It's all true. The situation is complicated in ways that go far beyond a normal relationship. I'll probably face trial. I'll have to rebuild my entire career from scratch if I avoid prison. You'll have to testify not only against Castellano, but possibly for me if Chen decides to press charges. The media will have a field day with the story of a police officer and a witness developing a relationship during protection." Jake paused, stepping back just enough to look Emma directly in the eyes. "But Emma, we're going to face all of this together. No more me protecting you unilaterally and making decisions without consulting you, like I did when I chose to leave that crime scene. No more you trying to carry the blame alone for consequences I chose. Together, as real partners who make joint decisions and face consequences side by side." Emma nodded, sensing something fundamental settling between them, not just love, but a deeper commitment to face whatever came as a unit rather than separate individuals. "Partners," she repeated. "In everything, Jake. I'll testify at your trial if it comes to that. I'll make it perfectly clear that there was no coercion, that the relationship developed genuinely, that you acted out of love and not some distorted sense of ownership or control." "Emma, this will expose you to brutal scrutiny," Jake warned. "Chen's defense lawyers will question every aspect of the relationship. They'll suggest you have Stockholm Syndrome, that you're defending me out of fear or obligation, that your judgment is compromised by trauma. It's going to be public and humiliating in ways that I don't care." Emma interrupted him with a firmness that surprised them both. "Jake, you risked your freedom for me. I can face some uncomfortable legal scrutiny, and honestly, let them question it. Let lawyers try to argue that what I feel isn't real, because I'm going to sit in that courtroom and tell the truth about the man who saved me, not just physically, but in ways that go far beyond that." Comment below, she's going to fight for him too. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because that moment of intimacy and promises Jake and Emma finally acknowledging love and committing to facing the future together was about to brutally collide with an external reality that didn't stop just because they had survived and found each other. And behind that interruption lay a hidden truth about what it truly means to love someone in impossible circumstances, that every moment of peace is temporary, that danger never truly disappears, and that decisions made in seconds of desperation have consequences that unfold for months or years. A knock on the door interrupted a moment with timing that seemed almost cruel. Jake and Emma still had their foreheads pressed together, still processing mutual confessions and the weight of the commitment they had just made to each other. The knock wasn't aggressive, but definitive, a sound that clearly wouldn't be ignored. And before either could respond, the door was opening and Rebecca Torres entered with a serious expression that immediately put Jake on high alert. Emma felt Jake tense, instantly, not a large movement, but a subtle change in posture that she had learned to recognize during weeks of living with him. That transition from relaxed to vigilant that happened when he detected a potential threat. The hand that was holding hers tightened slightly, as if preparing to let go and act. "Excuse me for interrupting," Rebecca said, glancing between them with an expression that suggested she had noticed the physical closeness and probably had correct inferences about what had been happening before she entered. But to her credit, she didn't comment or make it embarrassing. "Emma, how are you feeling? Doctors said your injuries were relatively minor, but they wanted to keep you under observation until tomorrow morning at the earliest. Better," Emma replied, forcing herself to focus on Rebecca's question, even though part of her was screaming that the expression on Rebecca's face meant bad news. "Sore, but functional." "Rebecca, what happened? You wouldn't have interrupted without an important reason." Rebecca hesitated. And that hesitation was more terrifying than an immediate response would have been, because Rebecca wasn't the type of person to hesitate unless the news was bad enough to require preparation. "Castellano posted bail," she finally said, the words dropping like bombs in the silence of the hospital room. "He's been free since 5 o'clock this afternoon." Jake tensed up immediately. Much more noticeably, his whole body shifting from relaxed to combat mode in a split second. "How?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority Emma had heard when he was in full police mode. "Rebecca, with charges of kidnapping, conspiracy, attempted murder, how could any judge justify bail? His lawyers are very, very good," Rebecca said, with clear frustration tinging every word. "Elite criminal lawyers that Castellano keeps on permanent retainer precisely for situations like this. And Jake, they used his actions against the case. They argued extensively that evidence was fatally tainted by his actions." Rebecca moved closer to the bed, her posture professional, but Emma could see tension in her shoulders. "They argued that you operated as a vigilante without legal authority, that the rescue was carried out in ways that violated the constitutional rights of everyone involved, that there's no guarantee that any evidence collected during or after your actions will be admissible in court. They argued that keeping Castellano imprisoned, based on such deeply compromised evidence, would violate his Eighth Amendment rights." Jake closed his eyes briefly, and Emma saw a painful realization that her actions that had saved her life were now being used exactly as she had feared. "And the judge accepted that?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Judge Thompson is known for being extremely careful about procedural matters," Rebecca explained. "He agreed that there were sufficient substantial questions about the admissibility of evidence to justify bail while legal proceedings unfold. He didn't say that evidence is inadmissibly, that there are legitimate issues that need to be resolved through appropriate motions." Emma felt a fear that had been temporarily suppressed by mutual confessions of love, returning with renewed force. "So he's free?" she asked, her voice coming out lower than she intended. "Castellano is free? Even after everything he's done? Even after kidnapping me and planning to kill me?" "Under strict conditions," Rebecca clarified quickly, as if trying to offer some reassurance. "He can't contact you directly or through third parties. He has to wear an electronic ankle monitor that tracks his location 24 hours a day. Has restrictions on where he can go. He can't leave the county without prior judicial permission. He had to surrender his passport, and technically, there's a restraining order keeping him at least 500 meters away from you. But he's free," Emma repeated, processing the implications. "Walking around, living in his house, probably already planning how to circumvent restrictions or intimidate witnesses in ways that don't technically violate bail conditions." Rebecca didn't deny it, because everyone in the room knew Emma was right. Men like Castellano didn't get where they did without being exceptionally good at operating within the technical limits of the law while completely violating its spirit. "There's more," Rebecca said after a moment, and that "there's more" made Emma's stomach drop, because if Castellano being free was only the first part, what could be worse? Castellano's lawyers filed a motion to disqualify all of Emma's testimony on the grounds that she was coerced by you, Jake. They're arguing that the relationship between you, to which they clearly researched and documented through subpoenas, validates any testimony from her as fundamentally unreliable. Jake swore under his breath, but vehemently. They're trying to destroy her credibility before we even get to trial. Exactly, Rebecca confirmed. And Jake, they have photos. You two going in and out of your house together, buying groceries. Emma obviously wearing clothes she didn't bring with her, suggesting she was living there. A through-the-window photo that shows you two, close in a way that clearly isn't strictly professional. Emma felt the invasion of it viscerally. The idea that private moments had been documented, that the intimacy they had shared had been transformed into evidence to be used against them. They spied on us, she said, anger mixing with violation. For weeks, they were watching and photographing us. Surveillance is legal if done on public property or with consent, Rebecca said in a tone that suggested she hated this fact as much as Emma did. And Castellano's lawyers clearly invested substantial resources in documenting your relationship specifically for this purpose. Jake was still holding Emma's hand, and she felt his fingers tighten slightly, not painfully, but reassuringly, as if reminding her that they were facing this together. So their strategy is clear, he said. To undermine my credibility by showing that I operated outside of authority. To undermine Emma's credibility by suggesting coercion or emotional compromise, and to use procedural issues I created to potentially obtain suppressed evidence. It's an effective strategy, Rebecca admitted reluctantly. And Emma, there's a hearing scheduled for next week regarding their motion to disqualify your testimony. You'll need to be there. You'll need to testify about the nature of the relationship, about how it developed. And Castellano's lawyers will do everything possible to make you look like a confused victim or a calculating liar, depending on which narrative serves them best at that moment. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because that moment when Emma interrupted Jake and declared no more, you sacrificing everything alone, wasn't just about distributing responsibility or being fair. It was about a fundamental shift in the dynamic that had defined their relationship from the start, from protector and protected to equal partners, facing threats together. And behind that decision was the revelation that true love isn't about one person repeatedly saving another, but about both choosing to stay and fight side by side, even when it would be easier or safer to run away. Jake looked at Emma with a complex expression that mixed pride with genuine concern, as if part of him was impressed by her strength, but another part still wanted to envelop her in protection and shield her from whatever was to come. I'll protect you, he said, and there was that absolute determination in his voice that Emma had heard so many times in the last few weeks. Emma, no matter what Castellano's lawyers do, what strategies they use, what veiled threats they make, I'll make sure you're safe. No. Emma interrupted him firmly, making Jake stop mid-sentence with an authority she had rarely used with him, but which now seemed absolutely necessary. Jake, no. No more you sacrificing everything alone. No more you making unilateral decisions about how much risk to take or which lines to cross while I remain passive and protected. That's not how things are going to work from now on. Emma turned to Rebecca, keeping her hand intertwined with Jake's, but focusing her full attention on the FBI agent. Rebecca, tell me honestly, and without mincing words, what do we need to do to ensure Castellano goes to prison permanently? Not on bail, not with a plea deal that results in a reduced sentence, but actual imprisonment for a substantial amount of time that reflects the severity of his crimes. Rebecca looked at Emma with something like respect growing in her expression, as if she were seeing Emma in a new light, no longer as a victim to be protected, but as an active participant willing to fight. Your testimony is absolutely crucial, Rebecca said, without trying to soften the reality. Emma, you are an eyewitness to the original crimes that triggered all of this. You saw the transaction, you can identify participants, you can Provide details that corroborate evidence we already have. Without your testimony, the case against Castellano is substantially weaker. Rebecca paused, clearly weighing how much to say. But Emma, here's a complication you need to fully understand before committing. With Jake facing criminal charges for unauthorized ransom, and your relationship being used as evidence of compromise, defense attorneys will attack your credibility in every way imaginable. They'll suggest you're biased by gratitude or love or a sense of obligation to Jake. They'll argue you were coerced, that you developed Stockholm Syndrome during weeks of isolation with him. They'll paint you as a confused victim who can't distinguish between genuine protection and manipulative control. Rebecca continued with brutal honesty that Emma appreciated even though it hurt to hear. Or, alternatively, depending on which narrative serves best at a particular moment, they'll paint you as a calculating liar who invented the whole story to protect the man she loves. They'll question every aspect of the relationship, when it started, how it developed, whether it was appropriate given the circumstances. Then I'll testify about that too, Emma said, and there was a determination in her voice that surprised even herself when she heard it coming from her own mouth. A determination born not of bravado or denial of fear, but of a clear understanding that this was necessary, that it was right, that it was the only way to honor both the truth and the sacrifice Jake had made. I'm going to be completely, brutally honest about the relationship, about how it gradually developed, about specific moments where I realized I was developing feelings beyond professional gratitude, about why I trust Jake completely and why that trust isn't a product of coercion, but of consistently seeing who he is in extreme circumstances. Emma, Jake said, and there was warning in his voice mixed with admiration that was battling protective concern. You need to understand what you're offering to do. This will expose you to brutal public scrutiny. It will mean sitting in court while lawyers dissect every interaction we've had, question the motivations behind every decision, suggest interpretations of events that make everything sound sordid or suspicious. Jake squeezed her hand, as if trying to convey seriousness through touch. They're going to ask about where you slept, about moments of physical intimacy even before today, about private conversations. They're going to try to make you admit that you felt afraid of me, or pressured to reciprocate advances, or anything they can twist into a narrative of coercion. And the media will be there documenting everything, turning it into entertainment for public consumption. Well, Emma interrupted him again, and this time there was something fierce in her voice that made Jake stop completely. Because Rebecca, Jake, I have a lot to say. I have a lot to say about the man who saved me not only physically but in ways that go far beyond that. About the man who could have operated strictly professionally and left me emotionally vulnerable, but who instead treated me as a complete person, worthy of respect and partnership. Emma forced herself to maintain eye contact with both of them, to let them see her complete determination. And I have a lot to say about a system that wants to punish Jake for doing the right thing. A system that would have left me dead if Jake had followed proper protocols. A system that is now allowing Castellano, the man who ordered my kidnapping and planned execution, to walk free with only an ankle monitor, while considering criminal charges against the man who rescued me. Comment below. She's going to fight for their love publicly. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Rebecca's promise we're going to do this right, and Emma's determination to testify weren't just about legal strategy or courtroom tactics. They were about transforming how three people viewed the entire case, no longer as a series of procedures to be followed, but as a battle for justice that would require a kind of courage that goes far beyond simply following rules. And behind that decision lay a hidden truth about what it really means to fight for something when the system is structured in ways that make victory improbable but not impossible. Rebecca looked between Jake and Emma for a long moment, and Emma could see the processing happening. FBI agent, weighing options, considering risks, deciding how much of her own career she was willing to risk to help. Finally, Rebecca nodded slowly, a movement that carried the weight of a commitment being made. "Okay," she said in a tone that transformed a simple word into a vow. "Then let's do this absolutely right. Not trying to circumvent the system or find shortcuts, but building a case so solid that even the most skeptical judge will have to recognize its legitimacy." Rebecca started pacing now, with that nervous energy of someone who thinks better in motion. "Emma testifies at a hearing next week regarding the motion to disqualify. We established a completely clear timeline of how your relationship developed, hiding nothing. Not softening uncomfortable moments, but presenting the complete truth in a way that demonstrates there was no coercion or manipulation. We showed that Emma maintained agency throughout, that she made independent decisions, that she was never prevented from seeking alternative protection if she wanted to." Rebecca stopped and looked directly at Emma. "And that means you're going to have to testify about moments that are private and vulnerable. You're going to have to describe the process of developing trust in Jake. Admit when you started feeling attraction. Explain how you distinguished between gratitude for protection and genuine love. It's going to be uncomfortable and invasive, but it's the only way to remove any basis for coercive arguments." "I understand," Emma said, and she meant exactly that. Her stomach clenched with anticipation of having to expose intimacy for public scrutiny. "Rebecca, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I won't let Castellano's lawyers turn real love into something sordid without a fight. And Jake," Rebecca continued, turning to him with an expression that was a mixture of sympathy and difficult pragmatism, "you need to be prepared for the fact that your defense, both in any criminal case Chen might bring and in any hearing about your actions, will depend in part on Emma's testimony. It will depend on a jury or judge believing that you acted out of genuine love rather than problematic obsession. That your decisions were motivated by actual systemic failure, rather than a desire to operate outside the rules." "I know," Jake said, and there was calm acceptance in those two words. "And Rebecca, I trust her completely. I trust Emma to testify honestly, even if that honesty includes moments where I was wrong, or where the situation was more complicated than I'd like to admit. Because truth is our only real defense here." Emma squeezed Jake's hand tightly, a gesture of gratitude for his trust, an acknowledgement that she wasn't going to soften or embellish things just to make Jake look better. "We'll survive this," Emma said, looking between Jake and Rebecca, together, not as victim and savior, but as partners facing the consequences of decisions we both support. Rebecca nodded, and Emma saw something like admiration cross her face. "Okay, so here's what's going to happen in the next few days. Emma, you'll be released from the hospital tomorrow morning if your vital signs remain stable. I'll arrange protection not through Jake, obviously, but federal officers who will keep discreet surveillance while Castellano is free. You'll need your own lawyer to represent you in court, not a defense attorney, but someone who can advise you on how to testify in ways that protect your interests." Rebecca continued detailing the logistics: hearing dates, security procedures, coordination between local and federal agencies, which was inevitably going to be complicated given Jake's situation. And Emma listened to it all, processing the practical details even as her mind kept returning to the enormity of what they had just committed to doing. After another 20 minutes of discussion about legal specifics and security arrangements, Rebecca finally prepared to leave. "You two need to rest," she said, looking especially at Jake, who clearly hadn't slept properly in days. "Jake, you can't stay here all night. Nurses will kick you out at some point, and honestly, you need to sleep in a real bed." "I'll stay until they literally have to drag me away," Jake replied in a tone that wouldn't accept arguments. "Rebecca, I'm not leaving you alone while Castellano is free. Federal protection will be stationed outside her room within an hour," Rebecca reassured her. "Emma will be safe. But Jake, you won't be of any use to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." After Rebecca left, promising to return the next morning to escort Emma when she was discharged, A silence fell over the hospital room, a silence that seemed particularly profound after all the emotional intensity of the last few hours. Emma and Jake just stood there for a moment, holding hands, processing the enormity of what they were facing. It wasn't just legal trials that were coming though, those were frightening enough, with the possibility of Jake going to prison and Castellano potentially escaping justice. It wasn't just public scrutiny that would turn their private lives into entertainment for strangers to analyze and judge. It was the trauma of having to relive everything repeatedly through testimonies. It was the uncertainty about whether the system would actually work this time. It was the fear that even doing everything right wouldn't be enough. "Jake," Emma said softly after a silence that had lasted for several long minutes. "No matter what happens in the coming months, and I know it will be difficult in ways we can't even fully imagine right now, I want you to know that I have no regrets, not a single thing, not witnessing that night in the alley, because it was the right thing to do even though it cost me so much peace. Not meeting you, because you fundamentally changed how I see strength, protection, and partnership. Not falling in love with you, because that is real and valuable, regardless of how complicated the circumstances are." Jake kissed her forehead with a gentleness that made Emma's eyes fill with tears again, his lips lingering there for a moment, as if absorbing her words through physical contact. "Neither do I," he said when he finally pulled back enough to look into her eyes. "Emma, I don't regret anything either. Not crossing all those lines to save you, because you're worth every consequence. Not loving you in ways that complicated everything, because the alternative would be not loving you. And that's unimaginable now." He brought his free hand to her face, caressing her cheek with his thumb. "And Emma, it doesn't matter where this ends. It doesn't matter if I go to prison for 6 months or 6 years, or if I manage to avoid charges altogether. It doesn't matter if Castellano is convicted, or if his lawyers find a way to get him off the hook. It doesn't matter what scrutiny we face or what public judgments are made about us. You and I will have a future together. I promise you that now, and it's a promise I will keep no matter what I have to do to honor it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because that promise of a future together, made in a hospital room with Emma still injured and Jake facing possible imprisonment, wasn't romantic fantasy or a denial of reality. It was a conscious commitment from two people who had seen each other at the worst possible times and decided that what they had built was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And behind that moment lay a hidden truth about the nature of love that survives trauma. That it's not despite difficulties, but through them, that you discover if the connection is real or merely circumstantial. The following hours passed in a strange mix of intimacy and interruptions, nurses periodically entering to check Emma's vital signs, Jake finally giving in to their insistence and dozing off in an uncomfortable chair beside the bed because exhaustion eventually overcame determination. Emma staying awake, watching him sleep, and processing the enormity of everything that had changed in the last 24 hours. Federal protection that Rebecca had promised arrived around 10 o'clock at night to agents discreetly positioned in the hallway outside Emma's room, a presence that should have been reassuring but only served as a reminder that danger was still real and present. Emma was discharged from the hospital the following morning after doctors confirmed that her injuries were healing properly and that there were no complications requiring continued hospitalization. Jake had been there when the doctor did his final checkup, had heard instructions on wound care and warning signs to watch for, and had asked specific questions about activity limitations and recovery timeline with attention that went beyond casual concern. And now, 2 weeks after that day in the hospital, Emma was finally emerging from constant federal protection to something resembling a normal life, though normal had been so dramatically redefined that the word barely applied anymore. 2 weeks of recorded statements and meetings with lawyers, and preparation for a hearing that would take place in 3 days. 2 weeks of Jake visiting daily, even though he couldn't stay due to restrictions Morrison had imposed on his contact with witnesses. 2 weeks of newspaper headlines and news coverage that turned their story into national entertainment. Emma was leaving the federal building where she had just completed another deposition session. Jake beside her, not as his official protector, because he no longer had the authority to protect anyone officially, but as the man she loved, as her partner facing an uncertain future together. And as they walked toward his car parked a street away, Emma felt that strange sensation of being watched that she had learned to recognize during weeks of being hunted. She casually scanned the area, not wanting to alert any potential observer she had noticed, and saw a man standing across the street. He wasn't doing anything obviously threatening, just standing there like anyone waiting for a bus or simply getting some fresh air might be. He had no visible weapon or aggressive posture. Just observing Emma and Jake with interest made something instinctive in Emma tighten her grip, recognizing that this wasn't accidental. "Jake," Emma said softly, keeping her voice low and conversational, as if she were commenting on the weather rather than a potential threat. 3 o'clock, black jacket. Jake glanced casually in that direction, not an obvious or defensive movement that would signal they'd noticed, just the natural look of someone checking their surroundings. And Emma saw recognition in his eyes too. Saw how his posture subtly shifted from relaxed to vigilant, even as he maintained an outward appearance of calm. "I see," he confirmed, equally gently. "Castellano watching us?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. Who else would have reason to watch her leaving the federal building? Who else would benefit from reminding them that even with an ankle monitor and bail restrictions, he still had reach and resources? "Probably," Jake admitted, his hand instinctively going to the small holster on his back, where he used to carry a gun but where there was now nothing because he no longer had the authority to carry one. Or at least someone working for him, making sure we know he's watching, that he knows our movements, that he has the ability to reach us if he decides it's worth the risk. Emma could feel the fear trying to return, that visceral fear of being hunted that she had lived with for weeks, and that never truly disappeared, even after her rescue. Fear that Castellano would find a way to get to her before the trial, that ankle monitors and restraining orders were just paperwork against a man with the resources and motivation to eliminate a key witness. But Emma also felt something stronger, growing alongside the fear, a determination born from having survived worse, from having Jake by her side, from knowing she was no longer alone facing this. A determination that came from having made a conscious choice to fight instead of hiding, to testify instead of accepting witness protection, which would have meant disappearing into a new identity, far from everything and everyone she knew, including Jake. "Then let him watch," Emma said, and there was courage in her voice that surprised even herself when she heard it coming out. Courage that wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, to not let intimidation work. "Because we're going to destroy him in court. Jake, I'm going to sit in that witness chair, and I'm going to tell every detail of what I saw in that alley, of what I experienced during the kidnapping, of everything he and his organization did. And no amount of psychological intimidation, or surveillance, or veiled threats is going to change that." Jake stopped walking and turned to look directly at Emma, and there was pride mixed with concern in his eyes. "Emma, you're braver than anyone I've ever met. But we need to be smart about this. Castellano watching isn't just intimidation, it's also information gathering. He's mapping routines, identifying vulnerabilities, looking for opportunities." "I know," Emma said, not downplaying the danger but also not letting it paralyze her. "And that's why we have federal protection. That's why Rebecca is coordinating security for the hearing. That's why we have a plan. But Jake, I'm not going to live in constant fear. I'm not going to let Castellano steal more of my life than he already has. He's not going to make me disappear, not through violence and not through intimidation that makes me hide." They continued walking toward the car, and Emma forced herself not to look back, not to give the observer the satisfaction of seeing her, nervously checking if she was still there. When they reached Jake's car, He opened the passenger door for her, with a gesture that was part chivalry and part tactic, positioning himself between Emma and a potential threat across the street as she got in. But before closing the door, Emma glanced one last time in the direction of the man watching, and she met his eyes directly, maintaining eye contact for 3 seconds that communicated a clear message. I see you. I'm not afraid of you, and this won't stop me. And then Jake was closing the door and walking around the car to the driver's side. And they were driving to the temporary apartment where Emma was staying under federal protection. Sometimes, Jake said as he drove, obsessively checking his mirrors to make sure they weren't being followed, survival is just the first step. The easy part, in a way. Because during survival, you're in pure adrenaline mode, doing what needs to be done without time to fully process it. He glanced briefly at Emma before turning his attention back to the road. The real battle begins after you escape, when you have to rebuild a life that was destroyed. When you have to face a legal system that should protect you but sometimes protects processes more than people. When you have to prove that the love that grew from trauma is real and not just a response to stress, that it's worth fighting for even when the whole world questions it. Emma reached out and took his hand, intertwining their fingers. And as Jake and Emma walked together, not just physically, but metaphorically through a journey that would test everything they wonder, the watchful eye of a man who had tried to destroy them, they both knew that journey was far from over. But for the first time, they were facing it completely honestly about what they felt, and completely committed to fighting side by side. Comment below. The real battle is just beginning. And as they drove through streets that had become simultaneously more familiar and more threatening during those weeks, Emma looked out the window and thought about the complete transformation that had taken place since that night in the alley when she witnessed something she shouldn't have seen. She thought about how she had simply been a nurse returning home after a long shift, an ordinary person living an ordinary life, never imagining that in minutes everything would change irreversibly. And now she was a key witness in a criminal case, a woman who had survived kidnapping and near execution, the partner of a man who had destroyed his entire career to save her. She was someone who had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but action despite fear. That true love was tested through impossible circumstances rather than merely declared in easy times. Jake, Emma said as he parked in front of the temporary apartment building, thank you. Not just for saving me though, obviously for that too, but for treating me as an equal partner in everything that comes after. For not trying to protect me from hard truths or complicated decisions. For trusting that I'm strong enough to face whatever comes. Jake turned to look at her fully. And there was that intensity in his eyes that Emma had learned to recognize as a sign that he was about to say something important. Emma, you've always been strong enough. I've just had the privilege of standing by your side while you discovered exactly how strong you were. And in the coming days, weeks, months, when we face hearings and trials and scrutiny that will test everything, I'll be right here. Not in front protecting you or behind pushing you, but by your side as an equal partner. And in that moment, sitting in the car parked under federal protection, discreetly waiting outside, Emma and Jake fully understood what they had built. It wasn't just romance born of extreme circumstances. It was a partnership forged through impossible choices and mutual sacrifices, and a commitment to face consequences together. It was love that had been tested in ways most relationships never face, and that had emerged not only intact but stronger for having survived. And as they got out of the car to face the rest of the day meetings with lawyers, preparing for hearings, the constant reality of living under the watchful eye of a man who wanted to destroy them, they both carried the certainty that no matter what came, they would face it as they had promised, together, honest, and willing to fight for a future they had decided was worth any price. Look, if this kind of story resonates with you, if you feel this intensity of love that not only survives trauma, but grows through it, if you understand that true partnership means facing consequences together instead of one protecting the other from reality, then subscribing to this channel is the way to continue walking this path with me. Because Emma and Jake still have a hearing in 3 days, where Castellano's lawyers will attack their credibility. Jake's trial is pending, where Emma will have to testify about their relationship in ways that are vulnerable and exposed. And they have to figure out if love built in extreme circumstances can survive when external pressure finally subsides. Comment below. I'm with you until the end, because I need to know if you're as invested as I am. If you felt that moment when Emma looked at Castellano's observer and refused to let intimidation work. If you understood why Jake kissed her forehead with that gentleness, even after using violence to save her. If you believe they will survive everything that's to come. And if this touched you in any way. If you felt your heart clench when Emma said "I love you" for the first time in the hospital room. If you understood the weight of Jake admitting he loved her enough to destroy everything else. If you recognized that determination to keep fighting even when it would be easier to give up. Leave a like so I know. It's you telling me that these stories of love tested beyond limits, of people choosing each other repeatedly, even when the cost is impossible, really matter. There's a video over here. She feels guilty for him risking everything. He replies that he would do it all again, making his feelings clear. Click and follow along there. The story doesn't end here. The real battle is just beginning, and you won't want to miss a second of what happens when love and justice collide. In court, see you soon.